Darkly Splendid Abodes, the official podcast of Toronto Thelema. Exploring, if you will, practical philosophy, from science and the workings of the mind to spirituality, esotericism, and magic. Stooping down, dipping my wings, I came into the darkly splendid abodes. Rosaleen Norton was an Australian artist who revelled in her public image as the Witch of King's Cross. But behind this public persona was a deep and serious practitioner of magic and mysticism. Rosemary Stehlik and I will attempt to peer into the true nature of this visionary, as well as the pan-inspired imagery of her art, as we continue our look at women of the occult. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law.
Love is the law, love under will.
Welcome back, Rosemary.
Thank you once again for having me here.
And welcome, Rosaleen Norton, who seems to be joining us in the form of her beloved thunderstorm.
Absolutely, and as we go deeper into our explorations, the poetic magic of this moment will be felt and understood by our listeners.
Yeah, this is yet again we have incredible synchronicities kicking in here. We were just getting set up and ready, and we have a thunderstorm kicking in. Mm-hmm. It had been sunny all day long, incredibly hot.
and as soon as you set up those mics, there was the breaking of the thunder.
Yeah.
and now the magnificent rain. And just really quickly to make a mention of that, we'll get into that once we speak about Rosaleen's entrance into this world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Rosaleen Norton is, she was originally born in New Zealand, correct?
Yes, she was. She was born on the 2nd of October, 1917. So we are back in the 1917-ish dimensions. She was born into the world at around 4:30 in the morning at the explosion of a massive thunderstorm. And she had expressed that the thunderstorm very much was the primal gateway that granted her visions to the other dimensions. It gave her that visceral, animistic connection to the forces of life and the mysteries of the cosmos.
So how very apt. So
we are very grateful to welcome Rosaleen Norton here in our conversation through the rain. She is sometimes referred to as Roey or Ro. She herself sometimes referred to herself as Thorn. So she went by many epithets.
As so many of our subjects do.
Yeah, and it's interesting because once again you have an individual who ended up reducing her identity to a mononym, a single word identity.
I should say, I suppose, that we're intentionally allowing the sound of the rain to join us. Hopefully it'll be soothing and not simply annoying. But it's such a synchronicity, we couldn't help but want to have it join us.
Yeah, to welcome that elemental, watery power. Even though Rosaleen Norton herself was a Libra.
As so many of these people are. Crowley himself is a Libra.
and interestingly enough, the fine gent, Dr. Neville Drury, who wrote her primary biography, was also a Libra, turns out.
Yeah, as you mentioned, Neville Drury's book, Pan's Daughter, is the one that we've been working from.
Yes, we can present the entire title to the listener if you are interested in seeking it out. It's very much what I would consider to be the primary source of a biography on Rosaleen Norton.
Yeah, it's Pan's Daughter, The Magical World of Rosaleen Norton.
And it's interesting because if you hear the eloquence of Neville Drury speaking about Rosaleen Norton, he sums up her work very poetically by saying, Norton's esoteric beliefs, cosmology, and visionary art are all closely intertwined. Her unique approach to the magical universe was inspired by the night side of magic, where darkness, mystery, and the quixotic world mingled with sex magic and gave birth to a magnetic image of dangerous beauty in her work.
It's a very good way of putting it. If you get a chance to take a look at or vidi Rosaleen Norton's work, it's really, really fantastic. It's and fantastical, I guess you could say as well. It's lots of very pan-related imagery.
Yes.
Lots of what at the time, of course, this is we're looking at mainly the 50s when she was first came to prominence in the public eye, and she was, of course, viewed as doing demonic work.
I mean, we'll get into a little bit of her timeline, but just to set the ambiance for the world that Roe was facing, you had the 1940s and 50s, an extremely puritanical, highly Christianized Australian society that had a very suspicious relation to anything pagan-esque or, witchy or demonic. There was a lot of satanic panic, I guess, before the 80s. And Rosaleen's work was very much preoccupied with the mysteries of nature that were born of the night, that were more dangerous and unpredictable, wild, primal. And she herself identified as the birth daughter of the ancient god Pan, as recognized in the Greek pantheon. She very much, in her sensibilities, was living the life of a witch that was deeply close to the earth, touched by the animism of the life force as it came through plants and animals and trees and the stars and the elements, etc. So her way of living very much can be seen as a precursor to the sort of neo-pagan revivalism that happened in the 1960s. She was just kind of ahead of herself with the Earth Children and the, getting back to the land. And I mean...
Yeah, there was the anecdote of her childhood where she would refuse to sleep indoors and would sleep outside in a tent and surrounded by all kinds of critters.
Yeah, because... interestingly, her family was very middle class. She, in her adult years, spoke of her childhood as almost like onerously normal and boring. So, as you pointed out, one of the things she did to try to break the monotony was to pitch a tent in the backyard, and she did this for 3 years as a child. She was around 8 years old or something, and she would allow, for example, this massive orb spider to build its web inside the tent, and she would see it as her pet, as her creature.
Protecting the doorway.
Yeah, to keep people out, like no people allowed.
So everybody's creeped out by the spider, except for Roe, of course.
So and as you get to dive into the labyrinth of her life, you get to realize that she felt way more comfortable surrounded by all sorts of pets and creatures, and seemed to have a lot more of a laid-back comfort zone with the creepy, crawly things that other people were freaked out by. But interestingly enough, most of society was more of a bane in her life than the things that other people kind of saw as noxious and, creepy.
Yeah, I was interested to find that, because in addition to the this book that we were working from mainly, I decided to put on a documentary that was just free on YouTube on Rosaleen Norton. And
Amazing.
I think it was actually, I forget the exact title of it, but it's probably the first thing that comes up in a search, or maybe the second. It's like a professionally shot documentary. It may vary, and I think you might have actually watched the same thing.
I saw it as well. It was really well done.
Yeah, and it was interesting to discover some of a lot of the information was just sort of helpful to bring my mind back to the things that the book goes over. But there was also, like, for instance, I don't remember in the book it addressing her art teacher.
Oh, yes.
Rainer Hoff.
Yes. Now, he's an interesting character because, well, if we were to kind of like maybe dive into some of the timeline of Rosaleen that brings her to around 1934, when she enrolls as an art student and becomes a very, intensely driven student of Rainer Hoff. She had a lot of trouble in her childhood when it came to being a good student. And this kind of is a theme, this sort of anti-authoritarian spirit that carries through into her adult years. She was known, if we were to look at her in childhood, to be very troublesome in school. She would disrupt other students. She would draw in class, and it's funny, I used to get into trouble in the same way when I was young.
I can definitely relate.
Yeah, so she got expelled, and her artistic talent was really encouraged when she joined the East City Technical College, and that's where Rainer Hoff taught. Now, he was a very renowned sculptor, and he himself faced a lot of backlash for some of his works that he was commissioned for by the public. And his answer to a lot of his work, or a lot of the commissions, was to bring in extremely pagan imagery. This is probably one of the first times that Rosaleen Norton saw another artist depict an image of Pan. Now, I wish I can remember the name of this particular relief, but if you look up Rainer Hoff, there's this massive relief that he did in which all these gods are like merging into one mass of force, of life force. And right kind of buried in the midst of all these extremely sensuous looking figures and gods and whatever is this horned god Pan that just kind of jumps out mischievously. And I can see how it would have had like a massive impact on her psyche.
It's really cool looking stuff. It reminds me very much of like the old ancient Roman reliefs and whatnot.
Yes, exactly. And I mean, when she was in school and seeing all this work and being taught by this renowned teacher, she also started reading on the subject of the occult through the Western esoteric tradition. So she started to educate herself as to, the ancient forces of the gods and goddesses of creation. It also led her to explore themes of demonology as well as the Kabbalah. And she was very interested in comparative religions.
Yeah.
So all of this started to brew in the cauldron of Rosaleen Norton, as one sort of ecosystem of witchery.
Yeah, and it does seem like her in point for things like Kabbalah, for instance, would have been like that which was brought forth by the Golden Dawn system of Kabbalah, and definitely Aleister Crowley's writings as
absolutely. I mean, and later she does end up having experienced Crowley's writings and was massively influenced by his writings on sex magic, which would get her in all sorts of fiery situations with the press, but that's later to come. By 1935, though, so now, we're moving past Rosaleen as a child, and she's in school, and I guess this would be the equivalent of college or something. She met somebody named Beresford, I believe, Beresford Lionel Conroy, that became her husband.
It's a very dignified name.
But of course, unfortunately, the efforts of World War II took all the husbands away. So he actually did enlist willingly into the army in 1940.
Yeah, I get the sense that she was not very happy about that.
She was not happy about that. And then strangely, so she's like flailing, going, oh, what am I to do with my life with my husband overseas? It simultaneously synchronized with her coming into contact with a magazine called Pertinent.
Mm-hmm.
The Pertinent. And
how apt.
Right. And in this particular publication, works were published like for the general public that dealt with a lot of more, what one would call more risque or daring subject matter of mind expansion, welcoming, exploratory poets, artists touching upon uncharted territory visually. So she fit right in with this particular publication. And she did a few drawings for it that are hauntingly similar to the sensibilities of Austin Osman Spare before her. So it's an interesting comparison.
Now, is this the magazine that because I know she originally wrote a few short stories that caught some attention.
Yeah, and this was a little bit it was she was at first picked up to be a writer.
Mm-hmm. She didn't want to do that.
She didn't know. I mean, she
didn't want to do it, but at a certain point she wanted to switch it over to her art.
For a long time, she actually sold her own original horror stories, like these little shorts.
Yeah.
And she thoroughly enjoyed this. This was for a newspaper, I believe, that preceded the Pertinent.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think it was probably when she had the opportunity to switch to something else that would appreciate her art. That was something
she wisely got into this particular, the newspaper beforehand. She got in there cunningly by acquiescing to the job request of the newspaper to have somebody write. And then she slowly turned the tables and was like, well, I'm actually an artist. I could do some drawings. And this did not go over well in time. I mean, she did do some drawings, and despite the technical prowess exhibited, thematically it was not what the newspaper was looking for. And it became like this unique blessing in disguise, because that's what launched her into the Pertinent. And that is where she started meeting like-minded artists, poets, creators. And that's where she met her future lover.
A poet in particular.
Absolutely, yes. Gavin Greenlees. So here we have a very intriguing parallel between Cameron, right? And
yeah. I mean, in this case, Gavin is 13 years her junior.
Yes, he is.
So at first, it's not a romantic relationship.
No,
it's purely a working relationship that eventually evolves into something much greater, and that will intertwine both of them for years to come.
It intertwines their destinies very profoundly. He, of his own accord, was identified as a very brilliant student with a profound future laying before him. He was very talented as a poet and was deeply influenced by the Surrealist movement. So he brought that sensibility into his expression through word. And so a lot of his musings uniquely dovetailed into Rosaleen Norton's visions. They were very complementary to each other. So she was a very, self-possessed alpha female, and he was much more of a sort of introspective, quiet, lithe, almost effeminate male.
Yeah, the documentary, for instance, describes him as a homosexual, but I think that's an oversimplification by far.
I think he was just extremely fluid from what I'm sensing. We have the privilege to see that kind of language be applied in retrospect because,
Yeah, things aren't quite so black and white nowadays.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they had an extremely fascinating yin-yang dynamic between the two of them.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that was around like 1949, 1950 that they really, let's backtrack a bit. Leading to 1949 and 50, they were dancing in each other's worlds, and eventually the professional relationship became romantic. They do end up moving in together into like this dilapidated place at I believe it's 179 Brougham Street or something like that. It is
yeah. One of those when you hear an Australian saying it, it's just kind of blurred into one syllable. Yeah.
Now we're looking around the time of between 1951 and 1954, and this home pretty much is starting to be legendary. It's officially within the district that becomes known to people as King's Cross. So we're leading to the mythos of who she becomes. So she's in this home, living with Gavin. It's literally crumbling around them.
Makes me think of some of the old Victorian houses downtown that, students live in and that sort of thing.
It was very much that. They took over the place. The place was overrun with all sorts of strange paraphernalia. She had a sign above the front door which read, "Welcome to the house of ghosts, goblins, werewolves, vampires, witches, wizards, and poltergeists."
That's comparable to Jack Parsons' "Only Atheists Need Apply."
And so there they are living in this place. You go inside, you've got Rosaleen Norton's massive murals everywhere. She had this gigantic, larger-than-life depiction of Penn. All sorts of variously sized paintings around it. Strange curios everywhere, people gathering in and out, very much like the parsonage. It reminded me of
so much. It reminds me also just the King's Cross area.
Yes,
reminds me of what Cameron would go on to, the kinds of places that she would go on to live in.
That's right,
and around and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I mean King's Cross was very much the red light district, and so you had
lots of bohemian little cafes and things, but also a lot of crime and prostitution and all the kinds of things you picture in a good 1950s expose.
But all of this was extremely riveting to Roe. Like, she loved the frenetic, primal tension that, of course, came out at night, which was her favorite time of day, the night. And the thing that was so cool about these sort of people coming and going in this district was there was a definite vibe of searchers and iconoclasts and people that really wanted to shake the foundation of authority and birth a new aeon. Again, the same propensity toward freedom and envisioning a liberated future. Now, Rosaleen also, in striving to survive, she was quite a hustler. She posed as an artist model for other artists to make ends meet. She did all sorts of things to... Oh, I hear the police coming.
Well, we're gonna be brought in on charges of vagrancy.
Oh, yes. Life imitating art. It's getting spooky now. So, yeah. Thank you, Rosaleen. You're quite the spark today in your spiritual presence. So there they are. They're doing their thing. They had these parties that would start at 4 p.m. I think the documentary talked about this. You had I really encourage people to see this documentary. She had all sorts of contemporaries that outlived her speaking about those times. It's fascinating.
Yeah, it was really fascinating. It's nice because, most of the time when you find a documentary of that type on that kind of subject matter, it's trash, and that's what I was practically expecting. But like, for instance, if you find any documentaries on Aleister Crowley, they're worse than useless.
Yeah, there's just so much sensationalism. And
yeah.
the thing that's great about this particular offering is that you have a very intimate, personal insight into Rosaleen Norton as a friend and as a kindred artist and visionary.
And somebody that was respected,
yeah.
not just thought of from the perspective of somebody who was trying to scapegoat her.
Yes, exactly. So there they are having their wild parties. They're, wearing masks and costumes and engaging,
basically eyes wide shut on a budget.
And engaging each other's imaginations, and the wine is flowing and they're doing their thing. And one of the things that the police at the time were notorious for doing, and I think this was their way of trying to control the gang culture in various neighborhoods like King's Cross. That's the thing too. Rosaleen very clearly started to refer to herself as the Witch of King's Cross. She just took on this persona, which became a tourist attraction, which it flowered into this big bohemian festivity. But it really irked the authorities. And the way they used to come down on a lot of people that were perhaps a little too free for their liking was to just randomly raid houses and charge people for vagrancy. And for those that don't know what vagrancy is, essentially it's just like being accused of squatting and
not being able to afford to take care of yourself and not having means, which is such a ridiculous concept to think about. Like you say, it's, I guess the idea was to deal with gangs and whatnot, but it really is kind of an excuse as a loophole to be able to throw that at who you like.
I really think that it's also a form of discrimination against artists and perhaps people living more creatively by frugal means.
Yeah, I mean, how could it be anything but discrimination, It's like, if you're struggling, then that's just taking advantage of you when you have no means of fighting back, because it takes money to fight in the law courts and whatnot.
Yes, and I mean, mercifully, so they had 24 hours to figure out their employment. That was the condition, which is just absurd. But as the cosmos willed it, they did come into contact with a gent who hired both Gavin and Rosaleen to collaborate and create a book together, and that he would be their employer.
Yeah, you know what? This is, I forgot about that. He showed up at the police station and asked them, he basically wanted two people to employ.
That's right.
And he happened to get them, and they turned out to be these great artists.
Yes. And this publisher's name is Walter Glover. He was, I guess, he was kind of like this visionary that had ideas about, creating enchanting, exciting, riveting publications, and saw Rowie and Gavin as the proper, perfect candidates for his patronage.
Yeah, it was great for him to see the potential there, and even took a huge chance on it, because he didn't actually have, which is so often the case in these kinds of situations when somebody's financing a project, you kind of have to, sometimes it's a huge risk, and you just dive in and assume everything's going to come together in the end, because that's the only way to get it done.
And so, he wasn't completely unsavvy. I mean, he did have conditions set upon the circumstance of this contract, where he essentially wanted to have primary ownership of the product created and the particular rights therein. So they created a bond that was win-win. There was mutual reverence for each other. And by 1952, a book was produced, the result of which was The Art of Rosaleen Norton. And this brought Gavin's profound writing with Rosaleen's visions together.
Mm-hmm. It's amazing that it's just titled The Art of Rosaleen Norton, and it has no mention of Gavin directly.
I think they were kind of coasting on the sort of sex appeal and the enchantment of
makes sense.
The Witch of King's Cross, because
going with that already existing fame. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, because they had already created this mythos around them by living in an unorthodox lifestyle, which became its own tourist industry. It's so bizarre. People gravitated to where they were.
Yeah.
Gavin's poetry, though, did play a very important role in bringing this strong additional esoteric energy to Rosaleen's explorations. And she offered several paintings, a few of which were titled Black Magick. Another one was The Rites of Baron Samedi. Another one was Fohat, which was her interpretation of a horned demon with a giant serpent for a penis.
That would cause her some. That would be cause of some complaint later on.
Yeah, that does become one of the bones of contention, no pun intended. But yeah, it was a limited edition that was printed, 500 in total, on a high-quality, refined, leather-bound.
Very much in the spirit of Aleister Crowley's own publications.
Absolutely. So, but the good news is, I say sarcastically, it was immediately banned. Immediately,
that's how you know it was good.
Yeah, it was outright banned in New South Wales for obscenity. Now, here's the thing that's crazy. It further created these ripples where it was forbidden to even enter the USA.
Mm-hmm.
Also, what's so wild is that if we backtrack, in England, we had just had the Witchcraft Act repealed in 1951. So this is very fresh. And in order to kind of get an idea of what Rosaleen was up against, it'd be interesting for people to go back and to read about the repealing of the Witchcraft Act in 1951, of which Gerald Gardner, was a big sort of part of that sort of ambiance.
Yeah, and it's interesting that there's that interaction. I don't think it's a direct interaction, but it's hard to say. But there is Gerald Gardner's doing his thing at the same time as all this is going on for Rosaleen Norton. And she's certainly familiar with and conscious of him.
Yes.
I don't know what his consciousness of her was, but...
Well, what's so interesting in retrospect, I know we sound like we're floating all over the place, but it's all interconnected. One of Gerald Gardner's primary high priestesses, Doreen Valiente, who's another interesting person we might want to explore.
Yeah.
She, in retrospect, said she saw Rosaleen Norton's work as very much in alignment with the Wiccan tradition in England, and her particular flavor of witchiness was known as the goat road, the road of the goat. The witches that seemed really drawn to nature worship and the worship of Pan.
Wouldst thou like to live deliciously?
And we know what Rowie would say.
We know what her answer was.
So picture that. So we've got this whole controversy around the lifting of the Witchcraft Act in 1951. In New South Wales, it wasn't lifted until 1971. So she's right in the void of all of this, feeling the shock and the reverberations of all this hyper-fundamentalist, puritanical energy of paranoia. A lot of her work triggered the masses because she was diving into shadow work and the dark side in ways that were in alignment with the process of an alchemist during their individuation process.
This is one of the coolest things about it, I think, is that I feel that one of the key ways I look at Thelema, because this is one of those subjects that everybody can argue over and have their own opinion on and that sort of thing, but I see it as being one of the key aspects of it is the fact that with it, you are to look at both the light side and the dark side and all things. This is where Pan comes in, right? The idea of totality. The totality of everything. And so like being able to go into the dark side, being able to go into your own shadow and be able to confront that. And
yes, it reminds me of the caduceus of Mercury with the white and black serpent intertwined, and in the coming together of so-called opposites. It's the engaging of the third mystery, the third aspect, which Jung speaks about a lot, about how it's in the integration of our inner extremes of the shadow and light that we give birth to that mystery that is the language of the soul, that is very, very much the chariot upon which the human soul evolves into its higher state.
I think that it's a bit tangential for me to say so, but there's the association a lot of people have with Hegelian ideas as with this idea that's not actually Hegelian, it's not actually Hegel, but is exactly to your point, and Crowley really liked this idea as well, which is that you have the two opposites, and by bringing them together, you move beyond them to a further, higher...
Yeah, the birth to the third aspect, which basically, I resonate very deeply with that third aspect, and that is the place of the primal mystery that Roe felt most comfortable in. So here we have this book, and, the je ne sais quoi hits the fan. Everyone's freaking out.
I think I know what.
And unfortunately, Mr. Glover does get charged with publishing obscene materials. It's a pretty heavy-handed charge that he gets slammed with.
It doesn't help his financial
no,
position.
it fully bankrupts him, actually, as a matter of fact. He goes 100%
Yeah, which is such a shame. But...
So, sadly, this did put a wedge in the machinery.
And I think the thing is for Roe and Gavin, well, for Roe especially, I think she was able to take this, and this is probably, I want to say okay with her, because of her personality, being that rebellious sort who wants to instigate, and I feel like her discovering that this was hitting a nerve caused her to want to poke the nerve harder.
Well, it's interesting because that's precisely where it ended up going. So we move into the period of her life now around between 1955 and 1959. So all of this unfolded. It was a sad outcome for everybody. But the thing that ended up happening was it now started to deepen that sort of archetypal Witch of King's Cross controversy. It really, there was this sort of stepping up of efforts on the part of the authorities, so the police, and tabloid sensationalists, so the newspapers, journalists, to, in this almost ominous Salem witchcraft kind of way, to join forces, get your torches and pitchforks and everything and start marching down to wherever she is and just wreak havoc.
Yeah.
And this went on for years. She became newspaper fodder.
Yeah.
Very, very vehemently as well.
And I mean, she wasn't, as much as the newspapers are just obviously out for whatever they can make a story out of and get attention for in their own right, she didn't seem to experience it as her being victimized. Quite the opposite. She she went with their attempts at glamorizing this situation, and she used that to her own perceived benefit.
Well, it's interesting. That's definitely where it evolved to. There were still people like swooping in and confiscating artwork from her exhibits and stuff. And one of the sort of sparks on the witch's pile of wood there came in the form of a woman who was kind of unstable in her mental health around 1955. This stranger, and I mean, this is just because of the notoriety of Roe and her lifestyle. Of course, it attracts the moths to the candle flame, right? This individual went to the police, did not know Rosaleen Norton, but this individual had delusions that inspired her to tell police that there were satanic black masses happening at the behest of Roe and Gavin at their place, and that she was, somehow in the know, as almost implying like she was there.
Yeah, almost like she was a victim of this coven.
Yeah, absolutely. And it, of course, after investigation and all of the sort of maelstrom that it whipped up, it came to pass that it was a fabricated story. But, I mean, that did not take away the fact that Rosaleen Norton had to face all these court situations and these charges. And Gavin and Rosaleen, at one point, almost faced the threat of a 13-year jail sentence for being accused of buggery. Buggery, quote unquote.
The abominable crime of buggery.
And these were based on some confiscated photographs from one of the raids of Rosaleen in compromising positions, one would say, because of her own personal alternative lifestyle choices that did reflect a sensibility toward SM type lifestyle. Yeah. But I mean, these photographs were in jest that were taken of her like getting the bumps during her birthday or something.
Well, you know what? They were incredibly well lit.
Right.
And if they were, it couldn't have been like a spontaneous thing because you'd have to like stage those. I've seen them.
Absolutely. And so they were having fun.
And they were not just confiscated, but they were outright stolen because there was no warrant for doing a search or anything like that. The police came and arrested them. And then when they were gone, these things were taken away from them. So clearly it's like this was illegally searched and seized.
So simultaneously with all this, now, in this particular span of time, and I'm so inspired by Rosaleen Norton's will, because she did triumph over a lot of these charges and pointed out the harassment and discrimination she was being leveled with.
Yeah, they did not ultimately go to jail for 13 years.
No, they did not. So around that time, because of all of this sort of notoriety and they were a mesmerizing couple. They drew a lot of people to them. And one of them was this heavy hitter of a conductor, Sir Eugene Goosens.
And I think he was actually like the one with the inspired idea of building the Sydney Opera House. At least that's what it describes in this book.
Yes, he was like the darling of every musical connoisseur's eye,
Knighted by the Queen for his work in music.
That's right. And so he sought out acquaintanceship with Gavin and Rosaleen, and they did get to know him.
Quite intimate. Infamously, even.
Yes, infamously. He did end up becoming a guest at their, soirees and stuff, and he himself had a propensity toward studying the occult and being deeply influenced by an occult lifestyle, whatever that means to somebody. But, he collected very unique and enchanting masks and robes and all sorts of other subversive materials. And it did turn out that there was an evolution toward a three-way relationship between Mr. Goosens and think that's how you pronounce his name.
Yeah. I think that's safe enough.
Yeah,
Goosens,
I respectfully refer to him. My apologies if the pronunciation is incorrect.
If the estate of Sir Goosens is offended by it.
And this definitely was the massive break in the levee, so to speak.
It was fascinating to some of his correspondence was actually included in the materials that was stolen, as I say.
Yes.
When they had done this search.
Yes.
And the correspondence that has become public alludes to various sex magic
Yes.
workings and whatnot. And at a distance, when he'd be traveling, they'd be doing astral projection work where they would meet up.
Yes. And here's the thing. Rosaleen's work as an artist was very much informed by engaging in deliberate trance states, entering into the interdimensional within herself, where she believed, the root of all of the gods and the mysteries of creation resided. And that she had almost like this mirrored self. It kind of reminds me of the microcosm and the macrocosm.
Yeah.
The microcosmic temple, and then mirrored in the macrocosmic.
Yeah.
In kind, in turn. And these were the visions that she would translate onto canvas. And they were, if anyone is in love with colorist sensibilities, her works are absolutely luxurious.
They do always seem, well, not always necessarily, but generally, I should say, they generally seem to have this, the images have this kind of feeling of force coming out of the body and ascending to higher, towards higher states. And then you can see all the states on the journey there.
And like dimensions within dimensions. And, you get this, she did this one personification of the god of fire. And within
God of hellfire?
Yes.
I bring you... Sorry.
Excellent segue. With the vignette of what looks like witches dancing around a bonfire on the forehead of the god of fire.
You know what? And it's talking about this is making me think that's who her art reminds me of. I hate comparing because it's not really a comparison.
I understand what you speak of.
But Lady Frida Harris, though.
Exactly. You've read my mind. You had a total third eye moment through the god of fire. Because if you look at Rosaleen Norton's work, she has a lot of the geometrical lines and curves of that, the force of nature manifesting itself before your eyes. And you see a lot of that in Lady Frida Harris's deck.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah, you can almost sense that she must have started with vague, abstract geometrical shapes and then created images of bodies overlaying that and following with the flow of the line and that sort of thing.
Yes, so very luxurious imagery. A lot of multiple eyes on the body. You get limbs that are turning into serpents. You get these sort of amazing fusions between animal forms and human forms, and a lot of which I relate to. Like a lot of my paintings have similar anthropomorphic, archetypal, the blending of the human and the animal, which we are. But it's a very healthy love of the force of nature in its untamed, wild manifestation.
Yeah, there's it's bringing to mind, I mean, this is a good way of describing all of her work, but one that's springing to mind, I don't remember finding it in this particular book, but I think it was in the documentary, it made me think of a more feminized version of Baphomet.
Yes.
And it was really really captures the essence of that kind of...
I mean, it may have been the painting called individuation. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, individuation is a really fascinating one, regardless. And
it has the Ouroboros in the background.
I'm trying to remember if that's the one that has Janicot, which, incidentally, it's spelt like Janicot, but I think probably the pronunciation was something like Janicot.
Yeah, it seems like a French word, yeah.
And I think it's a Basque deity that we can relate to the Roman god Janus. So this is like January and the doorway and
oh, that's interesting. Almost like a guardian of the liminal dimensions.
Yeah. So which is pretty neat. And I think the way, I don't know if that's individuation is the one where Janicot is looking over her shoulder as she's...
No, that's another one altogether as well. And I believe it is called Janicot, where he, or this entity,
it's almost
fluid
like a
entity.
It's almost like a guardian angel kind of peering over her shoulder, but it's like a horned figure. With, I think all of her creations tend towards having her favorite eyebrows.
I love her eyebrows. Like, as somebody that draws my eyebrows in, I'm just like, wow, she's got some game there. So if you figure, here's all this controversy. We're now heading toward 1957. Unfortunately, her relations with this masterful, fine composer falls apart. And simultaneously, her relationship with Gavin starts to crumble. So there was a lot of loss that she had to face for being true to her artistic self. She never apologized about her art, ever, which I'm so proud of her for. She didn't feel she was doing anything wrong, and rightfully so.
Nor was she doing anything wrong. That's true.
Exactly. So, it was an unfortunate split, and what ended up happening for Rosaleen Norton was she just ended up fully embracing the public's desire to see who the Witch of King's Cross was. So she just... It was one of those things that that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger. She ended up embracing this archetype and absorbing it into herself full on, and started using the journalistic sort of modus operandi, I guess, against them. It's like, you want to see a witch? Well, look at my witch hat. She would have that stereotypical witch hat on. Come into my place, I'll show you a ritual. I make a living by selling spells and curses. So unfortunately, I have mixed feelings about that.
Yeah.
I feel that she had to almost become a caricature in order to fend off attacks. In some ways, it worked. The vehemence with which the papers would always strive to dig dirt on her started to subside. It was almost like they could sense that she was mocking back. And they didn't quite like that too much. So, and I think you and I talked about this earlier.
Yeah.
What I feel bittersweet about is that here's this brilliant, brilliant artist. I think she's magnificent. And I think her inner work was constantly being interrupted by these external distractions and these forces that could not let her futuristic voice help them to liberate themselves.
Yeah, it kind of took her away from the ability to just concentrate on being authentic and starting to wear a mask.
Yes, she definitely started to wear a mask. And I believe her depths were protected that way, perhaps. Because by the time all of her fallout happens with all of her most beloved people, very much like Cameron, she goes deeply into a life of reclusive existence. And it becomes her and her art.
Yeah. With you mentioned the breakdown of the relationship between her and Gavin. And Gavin it seems that he was always suffering with schizophrenia.
Yes, he definitely at some point was diagnosed medically as schizophrenic. And he felt that she was the only person that ever truly saw his sacred essence and let him feel free to be himself, which I think he did for her as well. So all of these other parties, like, who are all these extra chefs in the kitchen, you know, like with your projections of the news headlines and these cops and like, I think all of the chaos finally took its toll.
Yeah. I think I was saying earlier when we were talking about it, it seems like when you become defined by being an adversary to something, then that can make you, like, put you in a bit of a symbiotic relationship where you need to have that thing that you're an adversary to. And I mean, I feel that way. That's a trap that a lot of people fall into.
Yes.
You know, especially in politically
heated
climes and whatnot.
But so this would be, you know, fast forwarding to around 1967. I mean, she left and then came back. It was that same sort of thing that Cameron did, I noticed. By 1967, she took residence in yet another derelict building in Darlinghurst, and then moved to a flat in Whitby, in Rosaleen Gardens.
I used to live in Whitby on Rosalind Road.
Oh, that is insane.
But this is Whitby in Ontario.
It's a little bit, another location, yeah. But I mean, who she took residence with were her pets. You know, her rat and her cat and her...
bat. Oh, wait, no bat.
I don't think she would have opposed having a bat, but...
No bat's blood, though. There was an anecdote about somebody...
Here's the thing. That's the thing that's so wild. Like, this constant statement about her being, like, sacrificing animals and being a devil worshiper. This deeply disturbed her. She's like, animals are my best friends.
Yeah.
They are the only source of peace in my life. And to even have these projected... stereotypes, you know, scrawled across newspapers, it really deeply upset her. You know,
so I could see where she would, as you say, kind of mock the news media, and she could still be doing whatever she's doing without any worry about that. Unfortunately, what we end up with, looking back to try and understand her, is what, you know, the media tends to leave behind.
Yes. So, with all of that, eventually the media circus subsided, and she proceeded to continue working in the arts until the end of her days. She did live to be about 62, and at which point she became really sick and sadly passed away thereafter. But not without, I believe, her work was purchased after her life. Her legacy was protected and purchased by a patron, I cannot recall who, for this mere total, like this frugal total of £8,000, her body of work. The only saving grace I see in that is that her legacy was protected.
Yeah.
So, and we spoke of this earlier, how important this is, given the fact that at some point during her exhibition years, somehow the police did manage to receive permission not only to seize some of her works in her exhibits, but to actually burn them.
Oh, yeah.
Some of her works were physically burned.
Yeah, being treated like pornography.
Yes.
Being such a... it's funny to look back from today, considering how different things are nowadays. But yeah, I mean, we saw this happen to Marjorie Cameron as well, the whole idea of obscenity and pornography being used as excuses for destruction.
And it's definitely more of a statement about the malaise of our society. The malaise of society that is projected upon people that live more dangerously or
Yeah.
in a liberated way as one with their shadow aspects.
Yeah, and it's bizarre to me to think why adults showing things to other adults should be so problematic when you're dealing with art like this. It's not like this is being shown to children in schools or something like that.
Yeah.
You're just dealing with adults who start losing their shit over it.
Yeah, it's pretty profound. And it's Rosaleen did end up sticking to her understanding of being the daughter of Pan and worshipping the natural life force and the night, etc., unto the end of her days. And on her deathbed was quoted as saying, I came into the world bravely, and I will go out bravely. So she was completely dedicated to her conviction to the end, which is just so inspiring. And interestingly enough, a plaque was dedicated to her on Darlinghurst Road, referring to her place of residence, saying, herein resided the Witch of King's Cross. You know, this whole sort of final exaltation instead of a damning, newspaper article. So in many ways, yet again, we have a fine artist that fulfilled her will on earth.
And we're still talking about her today.
That's right.
Even if it seems as though I think the documentary that I was watching, now that I'm thinking about it, I think it was in a series of forgotten lives. But
Interesting.
She's far from forgotten.
Well, and it's a testament, too, to the work that you and I are doing, where we want to try to exalt the legacies of individuals that have fallen through the cracks of the occult Western esoteric tradition. Rosaleen is now seen very much in the same realm as Austin Osman Spare, as an individual that devoted their art to esoteric pursuits. That very much was what she did.
Yes, it's very spiritually inspired art. As you mentioned, she would go into trance states and experiment with that.
Yes.
And long before she was known as the Witch of King's Cross or accused of being a witch or anything like that, or even involved in these parties and things, she was experimenting with trance. And
yes,
there's an anecdote I think her sister had about her having been spending 3 days straight in trance or something like that.
And it was to, of course, merge with her inner Godhead. That whole, again, microcosm, macrocosm, mirror. Her work definitely had an aspiration that was, I don't think it was as one-dimensional as this whole sort of like hokey, witchy stuff that the newspapers were trying to paint her out to be. Clearly, she had very mystical calling to fulfill her will on earth as a visionary and as a creatrix.
Yeah. I mean, if you just take away all that and just look at the art.
That's right.
It can provide you with a visionary experience in and of itself, I think. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Rosemary, and thank you for joining us, Rosaleen.
Thank you.
You've disappeared for the time being.
The thunder has ceased, but it reverberates in the macrocosm.
And in our hearts. Well, thanks again.
Thank you.
93. Thank you for joining us. Look for Toronto Thelema on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Watch for events in the city. And join us again in the darkly splendid abodes.